Do you mind if I use my phone as a timer?
What's the airplane will be on?
We're not playing Candy Crush.
No, maybe.
Trust and shit, yeah.
Thank you. All judges ready? Friend ready? I affirm resolved that the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. To provide some definitions, ought is used to show when it is necessary or would be a good thing to perform an activity. The U.S. Agency for International Development defines military aid as programs primarily for the benefit of recipient government armed forces, or aid which subsidizes or substantially enhances military capability. Military assistance excludes humanitarian and non-military development programs. An authoritarian regime is a government that concentrates political power in an authority not responsible to the people. My value is national security. National security is the protection of the state and its citizens through a variety of means. The best way to uphold national security in today's round is through my value criterion, which is objectivist ethics. The objectivist ethics holds that the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action and that man must always act for his own rational self-interest. We can apply this same theory to a nation such as the United States for the context of this resolution. The United States must act for its own rational self-interest and must be the beneficiary of its action. Within the resolution sits a key phrase, ought not. Choosing not to do something is an action by itself. By choosing not to provide aid to authoritarian regimes, the United States is acting in self-interest and is the beneficiary of the action and therefore upholds national security. Contention 1. U.S. military aid fosters and perpetuates terrorism. One key reason why the U.S. ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes is because it contributes to terrorism both within the recipient country and to anti-American terrorism. The Washington Quarterly in 2004 states that terrorism and its supporting audiences appear to be fostered by policies of extreme political repression. There seems to be a direct correlation between U.S. military aid to politically corroded or ethnically divided states, human rights abuses by those regimes, and the rise in terrorism. To support this inference, the International Peace Research Institute in 2011 gives you 3 empirical examples. They state that the U.S. quickly stepped up its military aid to El Salvador from almost nothing to very high levels throughout the 1980s. As a result, there was a wave of terrorist attacks on Americans throughout the 1980s. 40 incidents in total between 1980 and 1991, whereas there had been practically no terror attacks on Americans before. As military aid waned to very low levels in the 1990s, anti-American terrorism virtually disappeared, with only 2 recorded incidents since 1992. Similarly, in Guatemala, no anti-American terrorism was recorded in the 1970s. When the U.S. sent large amounts of arms to Guatemala in the early 1980s, a wave of terror attacks on Americans ensued, lasting for about half a decade. The third example, the U.S. continued to deliver large amounts of weapons to the Saudi regime throughout the 1990s. From 1995 to 2000, 43 Americans in total were killed by Saudi terrorists, making Saudi Arabia one of the top countries of anti-American terrorist origin even before the 9/11 attacks. There were no recorded attacks by Saudi terrorists on Americans before 1995. This study empirically concludes that a 1 standard deviation increase in military aid leads to an increase in terrorism by 135%. The Journal of Peace Research in 2011 empirically finds that when there is no military aid, the predicted duration until a terrorist group collapses is 4.69 years. However, when the U.S. is providing military assistance, the predicted duration increases to 7.82 years, which is a 67% increase. We therefore see that U.S. military aid seems to prolong the existence of terrorists. Military aid both fosters and perpetuates terrorism and therefore needs to be stopped. Contention 2. U.S. military aid is misused by authoritarian regimes. The Cato Institute in 2018 states that between 2002 and 2016, America delivered $197 billion worth of major conventional weapons, equipment, and training to 167 states worldwide. Using a risk index we created to assess U.S. arms sales, we found that 32 of the 167 recipients had risk index scores higher than the average score of the 60 nations currently banned from purchasing American weapons. They tell you that the United States should account more carefully for both the benefits and the costs, and should start in cases of sales and transfers to nations engaged in conflict, fragile states, or states with poor human rights records. as well as in cases that do not directly enhance American national security. To give some examples, the New York Times in 2016 states that the Pentagon provided more than 1.45 million firearms to various security forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. Taken together, the weapons are part of a vast and sometimes minimally supervised flow of arms from a superpower to armies, and militias are often compromised by poor training, desertion, corruption, and patterns of human rights abuses. Knowing what we know about many of these forces, it would have been remarkable for them to retain custody of many of their weapons, and it's surprising that they did not. These forces they particularly describe are the exact forces we're talking about in today's debate: authoritarian regimes. One of the problems with providing military aid to these types of governments is that they frequently misuse this aid. George Mason University in 2014 tells you that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, the US's largest arms importers, have each sold weapons to countries with whom the US has engaged in conflict, instituted embargoes, or other sanctions. In 2012, the Saudi government was accused of supplying arms to Syrian rebels, inflaming the conflict in which 25,000 people have been killed. In 1999, the US issued sanctions on Egypt for transferring US technology to North Korea. It is for these reasons that I, from the resolution, resolved the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes, and I now stand open for consultation. Thank you. Can I get some water really quick?
Beginning with your value today, you talk about national security, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so what constitutes national security in a general sense?
So, well, I define national security as the protection of the state and its citizens.
Okay, so in particular, we're talking about emphasizing the protection of rights.
No, just the protection of the state and the citizens.
Okay, how do we go about maintaining the protection of these citizens?
Look to my value criteria, which is objectivist ethics.
Okay, so does acting in one's own benefit always yield national security?
So what's important is that we have to apply this moral theory to the context of the resolution we're debating today.
So the United States.
Can I explain
Yeah, go
this?
ahead.
Okay. So the objectivist ethics basically tells you that if a person is to, or like an entity such as the United States, is to do an action, it has to be acting in the self-interest, rational self-interest, as well as be the beneficiary of the action. So essentially, if it's not benefiting from the actions it's taking, and if it's not acting in rational self-interest, you're not going to actually see that.
Okay, so we can only give this aid as long as we know that we're going to be the beneficiary of the action.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we have the foresight to know that this aid is always going to yield positive results?
It's not going to yield positive results. That's my exact point. I give you my contention one, where it fosters and perpetuates
Okay.
terrorism. And my contention two, about how this aid is actually being given to enemies of the U.S. That's pretty important.
Okay, so, but again, how do we know before we give this aid that it's going to yield results in any sort of
Oh, okay. Well, history shows great examples, and that's exactly what I proved. Also, I provide 2 empirical studies in my first contention, and that's very reliable.
Okay, so your first contention, you're talking about fostering this terrorism.
And perpetuating.
Okay, so essentially this is the biggest harm to national security, that we're creating more threats against the United States.
Like I'm saying, this is the biggest impact, and you can also look at my contention too, where I talk about how it's giving aid to these countries, and they're giving it in turn to enemies of the U.S., and that's not really going to help national security.
Okay, so you talk about in your first contention this higher duration of conflicts, essentially. What's your source on that?
Higher duration of conflict.
Yeah, you talk about how we're going to see like a bigger length in terror.
Yeah, the duration the terrorists survive.
Mhm.
Journal of Peace Research in 2011.
Okay, your second contention, what was your tag for that?
U.S. military is misused by authoritarian.
Okay, so essentially you give the examples of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and what was the third one?
Israel, but specifically I point out Egypt and Saudi Arabia because Israel is obviously a democracy, and that's not what we're talking about.
Okay, so essentially the idea here is that these authoritarian regimes misuse these weapons.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And so again, how does this tie back to this idea of national security? Because there are creating more threats.
So if we're giving it to our enemies, that's not going to directly benefit our national security, but in turn, it could be used against us. For example, right? They could say, okay, well now I have weapons, now I'm going to attack you, so like threats, right?
Right, and then,
but moreover, if they gain enough weapons, they can potentially.
So it's the duty of the United States to minimize that.
Right, if it wants to protect its national security.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I'll go ahead and take Ryan, we've got time to start the time back. In every single movie that I can think of, whenever there's an evil character that wears a black robe and cackles a lot, it's a sure sign that we're going to hear at least one dramatic monologue about power. Either how to get it, how to keep it, how to use it. In any case, these movies try to convince the audience that power is bad and that we as individuals shouldn't concern ourselves with it. And maybe they're right. But when we look to government, we see a very different phenomenon. It's not only okay, but it's morally obligated that a government should attempt to increase their own sense of power. And it's for this reason that we should be negating today's resolution that the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. Now, I agree with the definition my opponent provided, so we'll just move right on to my value for today's round. And that's going to be political legitimacy. According to Stephen Weatherford from the American Political Science Review, we can define legitimacy as focusing on the constitutional provisions that establish both wide public participation and ensure procedural regularity. So in a society like the United States, this takes the form of adherence to the rights of the people. And Stephen J. Heyman, a law professor at Duke, furthers this, where he says that the first duty of any government is to provide protections to its citizens. So in other words, only by securing the rights of people in the United States does the United States become legitimate. And that's going to lead me right to my value criterion for today's round, which is going to be political realism. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, factors of international relations create a system, government, that prioritizes the achievement of power and security for the state over any traditional sense of morality. In fact, Edward Hallett Carr, an international relations theorist, says that morality is the product of power, because the interests of a given party always determine what that party is going to regard as their moral principles. And therefore, the ultimate goal of any nation should be the growth and consolidation of this power, because in the end, it's going to lead to more security and create more legitimacy. And that brings me right to my first point today, which is that military aid creates security. Smith and Bueno de Mesquita from the Journal of Conflict Resolution find that donor states best promote their own political survival by buying policy from authoritarian regimes. They do this through aid. And this foreign leveraging is effective because according to foreign policy analysis, authoritarian regimes are particularly susceptible to US coercion because of the very nature of them. And these international bonds are extremely important because they help us maintain security. In fact, the Center for Strategic and International Studies tells us that in the face of growing threats from political rivals and terrorist groups, the United States has to combine with these international partners because we can't face threats on our own. And what's more is that if we don't combine with these partners, we're going to see our once allies flee to the aid of political rivals such as Russia and China, which according to the World Politics Review is what we've seen with African countries in the past. So any way you slice it, the fact is that we're decreasing United States security and undermining United States legitimacy. But that brings me right to my second point today, which is that absolute action is irrational. Judges, the affirmative side of today's debate is going to have you believe that providing military aid is morally impermissible. But unfortunately, the real world is a lot more complicated than that. And this is where being politically realistic comes into play. Because we see that morality can shift depending on how a nation can best secure its interests. So, no doubt, there are instances in which providing this military aid is bad, but that doesn't mean that we should deal in absolutes and say we ought not provide it. The affirmative tells us that we should act unconditionally without paying any heed to circumstances, but judges, in the interest of creating a legitimate government, we must instead act realistically and negate. But now I'll go ahead and move on towards addressing my opponent's side of the flow. He gets up here and tells us about his value for today's round as national security. Well, great. He tells us that this is protection for the citizens, and I couldn't agree more. That's, in the end, how we're going to achieve political legitimacy and maintain this moral good for the United States. But then we get down to his value criterion, and he tells us that the way we get there is through objectivist ethics. And he essentially says that we can only make decisions in which we know the United States will be the beneficiary. Well, Judge, the problem with this is that we can't make these decisions beforehand because we don't always know what the effects will be. So you're going to see my opponent draw these broad generalizations. In other words, he's going to say that, in general, we're going to see harms to this military aid. In general, we're going to see security decreased. But the fact is that if we're actually making decisions based on whether or not the United States will be the beneficiary, then what we really see is that those circumstances are going to change. And therefore, we can't justify this broad blanket statement that my opponent is making. So in his first contention, he essentially talks about how we're fostering terrorism. And the key impact of this is how we're decreasing national security for the United States. Now I'm going to have 4 responses to this. First, when we looked at Thomas Greaves from USAPP in 2014, what we actually see is that when we increase military aid, the threat of terrorism becomes no longer statistically significant. So in other words, the affirmative side of today's debate is not really solving for terrorism, but when we increase this military aid, we're making it less dangerous. And we know that because when we look to the Journal of Peace Research, what we see is even if the amount of terrorism is increasing, we're decreasing the effectiveness of this terrorism. So essentially, we're making sure that more American lives are saved. But what's more is that according to the University of Chicago, when we deliver targeted military aid in order to stop terrorism specifically, it's more effective. So if we want to solve for those harms, we side with negation. And all of this compounds in a 71% increase of United States security, according to Duke in 2015. So essentially, when we maintain these strong political alliances, we're creating more security for the United States. So my opponent gets up here and he tells us in his second contention that essentially this military aid is going to lead to net harm for the United States. But judges, I've already addressed this. The fact is that when we look to how this problem can be solved, we see that the answer is with more military aid. And if we look back to my original case where I talk about the foreign policy analysis card, essentially what this card tells us is that authoritarian regimes are bad, right? That's a given. I mean, these are regimes that crave power. But because of this, they are so dependent on maintaining that power that they look for the easiest ways to get it. In this case, it's the United States through military aid. And what that gives us is a large degree of coercion. So if we want to fix the problems that my opponent brings up, and if we want to solve for this misuse of aid, the solution is not getting rid of it so that they can flee to other countries such as Russia and China when we can't do anything. The solution is increasing aid so that we have more direct influence over these countries and we can actually push policy that we want. So, judges, it's for all of these reasons that I urge you vote the negative. Thank you.
Well, everybody ready? Hey Tim, what's up?
Hey, Amrit. Oh, not too bad. How are you?
Good. You nervous?
Not much. You?
Not really. It's pretty exciting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Alright, let's begin. You tell me that there's 4 responses to my contention 1.
Correct.
Do you respond to my contention 2?
Your contention 2, yes. Remember, I'm talking about how the best way to handle this misuse of aid is to increase military aid, because it gives us more foreign influence.
Okay. And you link that how?
Because essentially when we have more foreign influence, we're able to solve the problems you talk about, such as this increase in debt in Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Okay. So that third piece of evidence, you give me a U Chicago card.
Correct.
Is the author Choi?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so first response is Thomas Reeves in 2014. You tell me that when you increase military aid, there will be a decrease in terrorism.
Correct.
Can you quantify that?
No, well, specifically I'm talking that the terrorism is becoming less statistically significant. But the reason why that matters is when we look to my second card, telling us that as this military aid is growing, our ability to decrease the impacts of that terrorism are increasing. Meanwhile, the terrorism itself is not.
So your second card was Journal of Peace Research? Right?
Yes.
Okay, what was the year?
Journal of Peace Research, 2011.
2011, so the same one I have in my case, right?
Correct.
So what was what were you taking out of that?
Essentially that military aid isn't necessarily successful in reducing the amount of terrorism per se, but it is successful in reducing the effectiveness of that terrorism.
Okay, by how much? Like what's the quantifiable effect?
We don't know.
We don't know.
No.
But they do give us that there's an increase in 67% of the duration that terrorists survive, right?
I guess that's evidence you provided in your case.
So that's the same thing.
Right.
Okay. So back to that first one, Thomas Reeves. Can you quantify this?
Thomas Greaves, I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. What do you want to quantify?
Percentage, like when you increase military
No,
aid? Like
in general, it's simply saying that when we increase this military aid, then the statistical impact of this terrorism is not increasing with it.
Okay, but you do agree that 135% increase in terrorism is statistically bad?
135% increase in terrorism is bad, sure, but when we're increasing aid, we're reducing the threat of that terrorism, meaning that it really doesn't pose any problem to the United States.
Okay, but this study that I gave you specifically tells you that this is anti-American terrorism. So
Right.
how is this not posing
It's
a threat?
anti-American terrorism, but it isn't effective anti-American terrorism, so it doesn't really matter. You're not solving for terrorism on the affirmative either, it still exists.
Wait, where's the link there? How is it not effective?
Because again, I already provided you the card that tells us that when we increase military aid, we're reducing the effectiveness of this terrorism.
By how much?
I don't know. The fact is that with more military aid, the effectiveness decreases more.
Okay. Moving on to your contention too really quick. You talk about how absolute action is irrational.
Correct.
Where does this come from?
Essentially, it's this idea that when we're being politically realistic and judging the moral duty of any government through its adherence to legitimacy.
Who's talking about absolute action?
The affirmative, when they say that we ought not ever provide military aid.
Right. Thank you so much. You ready to take run prep time? Starting now. Thank you. Around 216?
Okay.
Thank you. All judges ready? Okay, let's begin. So judges, let's start off with my opponent's attacks to my framework. He attacks my value of national security by saying it will be better upheld on the negative side, but as you'll see throughout today's round, that's not going to be the case. Moving on to the value criterion, he talks about how we can't make these decisions beforehand because we don't know what will happen. Now judges, right after this, my opponent gives you 4 responses telling you what will happen. I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of irrational and illogical. If he's telling you we don't know what's going to happen, but then tells you exactly what's going to happen, well, which one is it? The fact is, we do know what's going to happen, and I'm going to prove to you that we know what's going to happen, and we should not provide aid to these authoritarian regimes. Contention 1, 4 responses. That's a bunch. Now moving on to his first response, he tells you that when you increase military aid, you're going to decrease terrorism dramatically, or there's not going to be a statistically significant effect. Judges, he can't quantify this. Until he can quantify this, don't actually look to his evidence. I actually quantify it by telling you that when you have a 1 standard deviation increase in military aid, you're going to have an increase in terrorism by 135%. He tells you it's not statistically significant, but we don't know what that means. He has to explain what that means, and he doesn't. And he can't quantify it either because he says we don't know what will happen, so we can't quantify it. But this study that I put to you in my case tells you that there's going to be an increase in 135%, and second, that Journal of Peace Research in 2011 tells you there's going to be a 67% increase in the duration the terrorists survive. Moving on to that second, he talks about the Journal of Peace Research, and essentially he tells you something about how it's going to deter terrorists or make sure that it doesn't, become worse. And I'm just going to explain this piece of evidence because we both have it in our cases or responses. So this Journal of Peace Research in 2011 basically talks about looking at military aid, and it does two things. It does an empirical test, and it uses a game theoretical argument. The thing that my opponent is using is the game theoretical argument. The thing I'm using is the empirical test. What we have to understand is, we have to cross-apply my opponent's argument saying that we actually don't know what will happen, and that's specific because we're using a game theoretical argument. Yeah, that might actually give a good indication of what's going to happen, but an empirical test will give a far more good indication of what's going to happen, because that's actually something that's been proven. That's an analysis over time, and we're using the same exact thing. So that's why you're going to prefer that part of the evidence and not the game theoretical argument. Now, he tells you that you Chicago card by Choi. Judges, don't even look to this piece of evidence because it's talking about military intervention specifically. The difference between military intervention and military aid is that military intervention is putting troops on the ground. Think Afghanistan, think Iraq. Military aid is giving aid or weapons and supplies and training to these countries so that they can solve the problems themselves. We're solving the conflict with military intervention, they're solving it with military aid, so those two are different, and therefore his card does not actually apply in today's round. Moving on to his fourth thing, he talks about Duke 2015, strong political alliances increase security for the US. Again, he doesn't really quantify it. Look to the quantifiable statistics and see that when you have an increase in terrorism by 135%, now that makes me question, how is security actually going to be increasing? Now, in response to my contention too, he says we need more military aid, not less. If you see, what you're going to see is that when you have more military aid, you're going to increase terrorism even more. And look to that 135% increase in terrorism card. It tells you that when you remove aid, you're going to see a decrease in terrorism. That's what it says. Now moving on to his side of the case. His value of political legitimacy, we're upholding that on the affirmative side. His value criterion of political realism, we shouldn't be trying to grow our power if it's going to hurt, if it's going to bite us in the back in turn. Right? Look to this increase in terrorism. It fosters, perpetuates terrorism. And moreover, we're giving these weapons and supplies to countries that are going to in turn give it to North Korea and give it to these enemies of the US and in turn use it against us in threats and in actions. Now moving on to his contention 1, he talks about how it creates security, but judges, this is completely false. Contention 2, he talks about how absolute action is irrational. Nowhere in the resolution does it say that the affirmative side is talking about absolute action. We're saying that generally we should not provide aid to authoritarian regimes, and for that reason, I affirm. Thank you. I'll go ahead and take the remaining
Real quick before I begin with my last speech, I'd like to run through some thank yous. First and foremost is to my family for making debate and waking up early on Saturdays possible. But then there's my family, which is the debate team, which is led by the Smiths. I love each one of them, but just in general, you guys are my friends, and we spend multiple days a week after school, hours working together. Thank you to our our president Jason Wang for being such a great leader. The LD squad, Amrit. I'd like to thank each one of you for making this year just so much fun and everything. And finally, thank you to everyone else, because the fact is that without you, this activity couldn't exist, and it really means a lot to me. Hopefully it means as much to you as well. So thank you to each and every one of you. With that in mind, judges, are you all ready? Judges, we'll go ahead and begin on some of the attacks my opponent leveled at my own case. So first, in response to my value of political legitimacy, he essentially says that he achieves it better. Judges, it's important to clarify here that in the end, we need to be basing today's round off of who can achieve the net gain of rights. Whoever can achieve the most protection all the time is going to be who wins today's round, and that's going to be important later on. But in response to my value criterion of political realism, he says that we shouldn't essentially try to consolidate our own power, because in the end it's going to help. Judges, I've already answered this. And essentially what we're doing by growing this power is increasing our foreign influence, which in the end gives us more leverage over these countries to get the policy that we want across. But my opponent gets up here and he says that these countries are actually going to turn on us if we continue to consolidate our power. Well, judges, again, that's not true either. Remember, I read to you the card by Foreign Policy Analysis telling us that these authoritarian regimes are dependent on the United States. But what my opponent didn't respond to is the other card I mentioned by World Politics Review, saying that those countries will turn on us if we don't provide this aid. So if this is a key harm to him, then it's what's going to be happening on his side of the flow, not with mitigation. But next, in response to my second contention, he essentially says that nowhere in today's resolution does the affirmative have to debate absolutes. But remember, judges, essentially the affirmative is saying is that military aid is outright morally impermissible. But what we have to recognize is that the aspects of morality that decide whether or not military aid is permissible shifts in each circumstance. So my opponent can hide behind this veil of being able to make broad generalizations and get away with it, but the fact is that the affirmative side of today's position tells us that this military aid is either good or bad. My opponent says it's bad, and we'll see why that's flawed for several reasons. Mainly in his value criterion, he talks about this objectivist ethics. Essentially that if we don't know what will happen, then none of the impacts of my cards I read to you actually matter. Well, judges, the fact is that this value criterion rests upon this idea of broad generalizations. And my opponent gets up here and tells me that I make those generalizations too, and he's absolutely right. But the difference is the negative can get away with it because we aren't dealing in absolutes. Instead, the negative side is telling us that we should judge each circumstance by how well it increases our political legitimacy. The affirmative can't do that. But let's talk about those cards. In response to my first one, he says that I'm talking about less terrorism, I need a statistical, quantifiable impact. Well, judges, that's simply not true. In general, we're going to see less terrorism. The reason why that's important is because in the end, it means more United States security. But then we get down to his response on my second card. He essentially says that we should be preferring his empirical test rather than the theoretical one. Well, judges, when we look to his empirical test and we look to Newmayer from the Journal of Peace Research in 2011, they say that the empirical test does not prove a causal mechanism. So in other words, this 135% he keeps touting about doesn't actually prove that it's a result of the military aid. So if he wants to keep using that number, judges, it really holds no weight in today's round. I say we go with the theoretical approach because in the end, it's the one that's actually going to weigh more moral impacts. But moving on, in response to my third card, he essentially says that this is talking about military intervention, not military aid. And he got up here and told us that the difference there is that military aid is training and support rather than actual military intervention. Well, if he had actually read the card, he gets up here and indicts, what we see is that it's talking about training and support. It just classifies it as military intervention. So the impact of this is essentially that when we target this aid at terrorism, it's going to go away. So that card flows through today's round. But next he gets up here and he essentially says that I don't quantify the increase in security. Judge, I literally gave you the number, 71% more security when we're fostering these strong alliances. If he wants to talk quantifiable impacts, the negative can get there too. But in response to my attacks on his second contention, he, again, essentially says that in the end, we're creating more harms, 135% impact to terrorism. Judge, we'll just go ahead and flow through my responses because, again, what we see is that specifically in authoritarian regimes, we can fix this if we want to. And Let me clarify. I'm not saying that in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, the examples my opponent mentioned, that we should be giving this military aid. But I'm saying that we ought to have the option. And that's going to be the clearest distinction in today's round. Because maybe aid in those two countries are bad, but aid in other countries, like Rwanda, for example, is good. So the fact is that we can judge each circumstance individually, whereas the affirmative position doesn't allow for that. And now we'll go ahead and move on to my voting issues for today's round. Judges, I'm going to have two. First of which is this idea of morality. My opponent and I essentially agree that the ultimate goal in today's round should be to provide the maximum protections to the people of, in this case, the United States. However, what we have to realize, judges, is that in general, what we're going to see is that the gaining of morality is only going to come from when we can increase political legitimacy. This happens at an individual scale. So when my opponent gets up here and tells us that we cannot provide this military aid, the fact is that if he really wants to maximize national security, he'll recognize that in some cases, this military aid is beneficial. In many cases, this military aid decreases terrorism. And that leads me to my second and final voting issue for today's round, which is choice. Judges, I've said this once and I'll say it many times more, but the idea that the negative side doesn't have to deal in absolutes makes it so much more appealing in today's round because we can adhere to that value of national security and increase it on an individual scale. Whereas he's drawing these broad generalizations and saying that military aid is always morally bad, the negative side recognizes that the world is a lot more complicated than that. So regardless of what my opponent gets up here and tells you about how this military aid is going to lead to harms to the United States, we have to recognize maybe that's true. But in many cases, it's not. And that's why we're going to be voting nay in today's resolution. Thank you.
Before we move on, can I see the University of Chicago card that there
Yeah.
seems to be some disagreement about?
I can show you my.
We were talking about training and military intelligence instead of intervention.
Is there just a thing?
I don't know.
Words define specific. Okay.
Can I see yours?
Oh, yeah. I'm not allowed to see his or not.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lose that.
How much background do I have?
You used 216.
I'll take the rest of it. 144. Got it. Starting now. I'm going to get in some very quick thank yous if you guys don't mind. First of all, thanks to my opponent, Tim. He's been a very funny person. And the rest of the LD squad, Lucia and Mo, they're very funny too. And all together, it's a funny group. It's a lot of fun. And I had a lot of fun. Obviously, I'm a senior, he's a junior. So, you have one more year. And the rest of them also have years, but it's going to be sad to leave the school. Pretty emotional. But most importantly, I want to thank my parents and my sister, specifically my parents and my sister, sorry. I'm not going to differentiate, but they've all been very motivating and supportive of me. As for my coaches, Daniel Smith, very motivational. Mr. Smith, he talks to me about almost anything. He's very open, very friendly, and I just enjoy being in his presence. As well as the rest of the debate. You guys are interesting. I do have fun, to say the least. And of course, Thomas Smith. And something about the Smith family, am I right? So, thanks to everybody. And Randy for cross-exing me earlier today. But, it's really these moments that make life special. So, now to the fun part, debate. Sorry about that. Let's begin. So, judges, I'm gonna have 3 voter issues for this speech. First, terrorism. You're gonna want to weigh the impacts. In my opponent's last rebuttal, he tells you that I have no causal relation in my study that I provide you with. It tells you there's going to be an increase in 135%. And the fact is, none of these studies have causal relations. They're all correlations. But the important thing you have to point out, or the important thing to notice, is which one gives you the strongest correlation. Now, I give you quantifiable evidence, telling you that there's a strong correlation and an increase in 135%. My opponent doesn't really quantify these things. He just gives you these author opinions that say, oh, okay, terrorism is going to decrease when you increase military aid, and etc. What's very important is that you look at the fact that these are correlations, and my opponent saying that this is not a causal relation or it is a causal relation, not a causal relation, doesn't really matter. Now, he attacked, or he backed up his Chicago part by saying it's not really intervention. Obviously, you guys saw it, but for the other judges, I'm just going to read it. It says, a cross-sectional time series data analysis of 165 countries from 1968 to 2005 reveals that when military interventions are categorized according to intensity, only those with moderate numbers of troops are consistent. I'm going to stop there. Moderate numbers of troops, that's very, very much military intervention. If you look back, or if you remember back to my first rebuttal, I tell you that the difference between military intervention and military aid is that military intervention is putting troops on the ground. This study is talking about putting troops on the ground, and therefore you see a rise in terrorism. That's not military aid. Okay. What's really important is that we weigh the impacts of terrorism. Who gives you the quantifiable evidence? Who gives you the quantifiable statistics? And who's going to actually tell you whether or not their world is more preferable? You're going to see that the affirmative world is more preferable. Second voter issue. He wants to talk about moral absolutes a lot. And I said, that's not actually going to be a logical thing to do. Because, judges, not one place in the resolution does it say the United States should never provide aid to authoritarian regimes. It says ought not. Remember back to the first negative rebuttal. He tells you that he agrees with all my definitions. I define ought as, generally being able to, let me just read it. Ought is used to show when it is necessary or would be a good thing to perform an activity. Right? When it is necessary or would be a good thing. When you determine what's a good thing to perform, you're going to see that you're going to weigh the impacts, the costs and the benefits, and see that if the benefits overweigh the costs, then you're going to go with that. But what we see with the negative world is that the costs actually weigh out the benefits. We see an increase in terrorism, and we see a far worse off world, and that's why you prefer the affirmative side. Because you're going to see a lot more terrorism, and you're not going to actually like it. Now moving on to the third voter issue, judges, all in all, national security is fine. I mean, look to my second contention where I tell you, we're giving arms to these countries. They're giving it to other countries that are enemies of the U.S. How is that going to directly enhance our national security? It's not. You see terrorism increase. That's not going to help. It's specifically anti-American terrorism. We're seeing attacks on our own country, regardless of whether or not there are foreign relations.